Good afternoon. Lo siento, no hablo español. But thank you so much for having me here. It is a privilege and honor to share with you what we've learned about collaboration at the Intersector Project, but also to learn from you about what collaboration means in Chile. One of the challenges for this topic is when we discuss it at an abstract level, we forget the context and how important that is for this topic. And so I'm very keen to meet and speak with all of you here today to learn from you as well. The purpose of my presentation is to share with you what we've learned on a particular type of collaboration. The Intersector Project focuses on government, business, and nonprofit sector, tri-sector collaborations, as we like to call them. As mentioned in my introduction, I think we bring a unique perspective on this topic. With a research, advisory, and teaching perspective, I actually came to looking at this topic of collaboration through the lens of the mining, oil, and gas industry. I'm Canadian, and I became interested in the topic of government, business, nonprofit collaboration when looking at how countries work with industry and civil society in post-free trade agreement environments to foster a sense of collaboration to develop sustainable solutions. So it's with great interest and relevance that I come here today. A bit about the Intersector Project. The reason I want to share with you a little bit more about our work is because I think for many of you who hold a deep interest in this topic, we might be producing content and resources that you will find valuable after you leave this conference and are then faced with tasks of implementing collaborations. So the Intersector Project is a New York-based nonprofit research organization. It actually takes forward several years of work that was done at the Harvard Kennedy School through the program on collaborative governance. Our experience with thinking and practice around cross-sector collaboration is informed by extensive dialogue with leaders from government, business, and the nonprofit sector, and a variety of research, programmatic support, convening, and service activities that we've conducted over the last few years. We consider our audience to be managers from any sector who are faced with having to work across sectors, and we also are kind of commentators and observers of this field of collaboration. Practically, we've produced 40 case studies of successful cross-sector partnerships, published them for free on our website, and as a process-specific rather than issue-specific organization, our content looks at the common elements of successful collaborations in educational initiatives, infrastructure initiatives, health and wellness programs, etc. We've engaged and been fortunate to engage with a range of organizations ranging from the NASA space agencies to look at how they are looking at collaboration to small community service groups, as well as public sector associations and fellowship programs that are aiming to develop the next generation of collaborative leaders. Perhaps most importantly, though, is why does something like the Intersector Project need to exist? Well, we think the why to collaboration is becoming increasingly important, and everyone is generally aware of it. Single sector solutions are not going to solve systemic issues. I think we generally understand that. But how we go from the why to the how is a key step. Everyone can get behind the idea of collaboration. It's hard to be against it. But when you actually need to implement it in your job, it's quite challenging. And so we aim to aggregate resources that will be helpful to practitioners. And I'm going to share with you some of the findings that we've learned from our cases, as well as our experience in serving this field. But first, let's think about how we calibrate ourselves towards this conversation. Now, when I was preparing this presentation, I thought by this time in the day, I think the audience will be relatively inspired. There's a lot of positive energy in the room around collaboration. But often we find what is most important is what happens after you leave this room and after what you take with it, what you learned. I'm curious, and if I could ask just by show of hands, I want to test your perception of collaboration. And to do it very honestly, meaning maybe before you came into this room and had this positive energy and inspiration. Just by show of hands, who here thinks collaboration is very, very important to society, but might be too difficult to consistently implement? Anyone? A few people. Quite a few people. And I think that is representative of many practitioners that we've engaged with across a variety of industries. I mentioned that we developed 40 case studies of successful cross-sector partnerships. When we were interviewing those leaders and managers who had forged these successful cross-sector partnerships, we asked them, what were the tactics that you used? How did you make it work? And more often than not, the answer was, well, to be honest, it was probably a bit of an imperfect process. I kind of struggled through it, and I figured out how it should work as I went along. They said it was a good outcome. The organizations learned how to work more effectively. The individuals learned, and that is valuable. But they said, it probably took a lot longer and was more resource intensive than we thought, which might make it hard to justify scaling collaboration. And I think that's a key insight, because if we are to address societal issues that relate to sustainability, we need scalable collaborative solutions. How many of you, by show of hands, think the costs of collaborating, the time involved, etc., typically exceed the benefits of collaboration? Just by show of hands. Does anyone believe that? No, I did not see a single hand go up. And that's another important part, is that the belief in collaboration is what the real energy is going to be going forward. We just said it's pretty difficult to implement consistently, but we believe in this type of solution. And this is an important driver and feature of many successful cross-sector partnerships, because if you want to be collaborative, you better be resilient, and you have to have a lot of ability to persevere through organizational and individual challenges that you'll face. So, thinking about the philosophy of collaboration, we spoke a little bit about why it's important, but what do we even mean by philosophy of collaboration? Well, we think this is about the value, ethics, knowledge, and motivations that inspire this type of collaboration. Obviously, it is to develop solutions, but why this rather than single sector approaches? In this era, we may wholeheartedly believe in collaboration, but that was not typically the case, and still isn't in many industries and geographies. There is relatively limited comparative work done between single sector and cross-sector approaches. Yet, we believe that this is the way forward. Partnership and collaboration is also an ambiguous term. It means many different things to many different people. When we were conducting our case studies, many times when we would talk to practitioners about their expectations for collaboration, the differences between what the public sector practitioner thought was collaborative from what the industry perspective was collaborative from the nonprofit sector was typically quite different. And so you still need to reach a sort of collaboration equilibrium. What does that mean in practice? It means you have pretty challenging project management. You have to find ways of building a common understanding of a problem. And then, most significantly, how do you navigate the power dynamics that will exist and will not go away. These are the challenges that practitioners of collaboration face. The value of collaboration, though, is driven by belief, but it is both intrinsic and instrumental. It is intrinsic in the sense that our belief in collaboration means it is almost a sort of public value. It is something that we want to pride ourselves on as a society, whether it be in our communities, whether it be at a city level, a state level, or national level. No one doesn't want to be collaborative. It has instrumental value because it is a problem-solving method. And when the outcomes can be produced through collaboration, they're phenomenal and they're celebrated. And the organizations and individuals that participate really appreciate the positive attention. It is a way of distinguishing oneself in a competitive environment. We know that single sector approaches are inadequate. We know that collaboration is important. But perhaps a bit counterintuitively, the positive connotation of collaboration can also be a weakness. And what I mean by this is when we looked at our cases, we look at the field of collaboration and how it's practiced. Because we're all so strongly believing in it as a process, we sometimes ignore opportunities to rigorously analyze this in the way that we would other operational processes to figure out how can we do it better. How do we start to lower those transaction costs that are involved in collaborations? And so we think that, in some ways, the world of collaboration would benefit from a bit more of competitive thinking on how do we collaborate better. The practice of collaboration. So I mentioned before, going from the abstract and the why to the how is very important. What we have found is that there are a growing number of types of collaboration, from advisory groups to task forces to new types of programs that solve program implementation issues, to new funding mechanisms, whether it be initiatives like blended finance or new forms of public-private capital pooling that enable or require some type of collaboration. A growing number of organizations or individuals, as this room suggests, are thinking about how do we collaborate more effectively. At the individual level, you're seeing more training programs, more fellowship initiatives, and the cultivation of what we sometimes like to call tri-sector leaders. Leaders who have capabilities, competency, and credibility across government, business, and the nonprofit sector. There are relatively few people who can boast that type of experience, but it is increasingly clear that the more tri-sector leaders we have, the more confidence maybe we should have that the big problems that are going to be solved by leaders are going to be solved collaboratively. Because leadership that is able to navigate policy, markets, accessibility issues simultaneously is a type of leadership that I think will be important for addressing sustainability. At the organizational level, we've been exposed to many new forms of partnerships, from innovative workforce development programs that are partnering with nonprofit organizations to address skills gaps in growing fields, like in technology education particularly. That is a new form of partnership that is proliferating, at least in the United States. Additionally, more roundtables that encourage more comprehensive understandings of problems. One of the most important and memorable case studies that we looked at in our research was an initiative in Minnesota where they were discussing transportation infrastructure. And historically, that becomes a debate over project costs, etc. But the group that was spearheading this effort wanted to ensure a comprehensive understanding of the problem and invited nonprofit organizations to participate in the conversations with the transportation infrastructure companies, with the policymakers that brought an unprecedented concern for accessibility issues and economic mobility issues to the transportation discourse, which set a precedent then for how conversation should be had on this topic. At the Intersector Project, we sometimes like to think about the micro-collaboration factors, which are kind of the tactics, the initiatives that happen at a very project-specific level. Some of the tactics I'll discuss, touch on that. Training, education, but then also thinking about these macro-collaboration factors. Sometimes we ignore or don't provide enough attention towards the legal and political forces that influence organizational psychology and our propensity and, frankly, ability to collaborate. When we focus on tri-sector collaborations, we're often focusing on a form of collaboration that we call collaborative governance. And if the public sector is typically the steward of public problems, collaboration will often require the public sector to think innovatively about how they work with non-state groups. That's why the legal boundaries set at the city, state, and national levels are particularly important. There is a risk aversion to collaborating within the public sector that is very understandable. And building programs and opportunities for those in the public sector to appropriately innovate with non-state actors should be a priority for many municipalities, states, and countries that are trying to be pioneers in the field of public sector innovation and collaboration, which will likely foster increased and more effective cross-sector collaboration. While the future for collaboration, I think, is generally bright, there are still some challenges that we face. I think, by and large, collaboration is still a reactive rather than proactive approach. As I go back to what we learned from looking at so many examples of collaboration, in many cases, it was a special leader or manager who decided to try and do something in a different way. And once they started it, their organizational support maybe was a little bit less than what they had hoped for. And then they really had to trudge through a number of challenges to be successful. The limited organizational processes and protocols around collaboration are also an issue. We don't think of collaboration functions in the way that we would accounting or marketing or these traditional domains. Building collaboration intelligently into job descriptions will actually go a long way into building organizational support for more effective collaboration and significantly provide practitioners of collaboration with rationale and supports within their organization to actually do this. I wanted to ensure that by the end of my presentation you felt like you at least learned a couple of things that you didn't know before about this topic. One of the things the Intersector Project produced after our case studies was our toolkit for cross-sector collaboration. And our vision was, how do we summarize what we learned in a way that people will actually read it, that it is concise and meaningful? And so we came up with this toolkit model, which said that we're going to highlight the 17 most important tactics for successful cross-sector partnerships. But we're not allowed to write more than 2 pages about any one of these tactics. So on in this resource, we outline what the tactic is, why it matters, provide some questions to guide tool use, a case study example, and some additional resources for practitioners to then take and use in their resource. We've published this and shared it with a variety of organizations. I wanted to highlight a few of the ones that we found to be most important and I think relevant to practicing collaboration. First, assessing the history of the issue. This simply means examining previous efforts at collaboration that were trying to tackle a similar issue. While it may sound like common sense to learn from the past, in many cases, collaborations jumpstart into a process that just acknowledge the present situation and don't try and learn from others' mistakes. There's a notable absence of learning from failure in the collaboration field. If you Google case studies on collaboration, 99% of them will be on successful cross-sector partnerships. I assure you, the success rate of cross-sector collaboration is not 99%. There is a lot of learning from failure and challenges to be done. Looking at the past is one way of doing this. One really important example, in one of our case studies, there was a waterfront development that was being done in the city of Detroit. And there had been many previous efforts throughout the decades to try and address the development issue. One thing that this mayor did, though, that was particularly important, was he ensured that the development process began with a 90-day evaluation of previous efforts through a 34-person stakeholder group that was cross-sector in nature. They benchmarked what had worked well and what didn't work well in previous collaborative efforts. They looked at what other cities did. That type of due diligence is probably common in other organizational functions, but is still a little atypical for collaboration. Another example, building a common fact base. Having a shared understanding of the problem is a prerequisite for efficient collaboration, but because of our organizational functions and our job descriptions, in many cases, we will have a different experience with the problem that this collaborative effort is trying to address. And that's understandable, but it needs to be discussed, and people need to be aware of how their perception of the problem may differ from others. In practice, we go back to the example I mentioned around the transportation infrastructure. Many of the policymakers and the infrastructure companies had not ever been required or been encouraged to think about the accessibility and economic mobility issues. And so that was a benefit to understanding the problem in a more comprehensive way. Establishing a governance structure. One of the most famous cross-sector collaborations in the United States right now is a school that they built in New York City that was called PTech. And basically it was a 6-year school that provided a high school education and an associate's college degree in technical education to students who otherwise typically would not pursue this. This case study received acclaim because IBM, the City University of New York, and the Department of Education collaborated to build a new form of school. Education innovation is very controversial. But what this group did is they built a governance structure that was inclusive of parents, inclusive of industry, and they were able to ultimately foster solutions that would otherwise not be possible, receiving significant acclaim across the country. Going forward, the future of cross-sector collaboration. How do we advance the thinking and practice on this topic? How do we go beyond today and make this practical? A couple ideas that I want to focus on. One, finding ways for us to translate that appreciation of collaboration as a public value into more rigorous organizational processes. Developing internal diagnostic tools that help us identify in the early stages the benefits of collaboration in both quantitative and qualitative terms. That will enable benchmarking of collaborative processes in the way that we do similar organizational processes. I think if the language in which we perform other functions, whether it be in policy work or business work, is introduced to the field of collaboration, we'll start to see more and more effective practice. This can culminate in organizations self-assessing through auditing type functions on what processes, protocols, and values they have internally that impede or enable collaboration. I want to thank everyone for listening to our presentation, and I look forward to being able to speak with you further about this increasingly important topic and learning about what it means for you individually in your job, what it means to collaborate, as well as within your organization. I think what we've found, we've done many events like this, and it's what happens after is most important. And we hope that our resources at the Intersector Project can be of service to you. So thank you very much.